If I could also ask Dr. Beckman and Dr. Smart to come up, and we're going to turn up the house lights and do a little microphone reconfiguration. We want you to be able to ask questions to all these experts. But as we're doing that, I'd like to start and ask Dr. Bedlack a question.
Okay.
In your work, this patient focus, let's look at what people are doing in the real world. You seem on the cutting edge of doing that kind of work. Are you finding your peers and colleagues at other ALS centers are open to working in a similar way?
Just like there's not one patient, I don't think there's one type of doctor, but I do think most of the doctors that are working in ALS are very patient-centric and want to engage in shared decision-making. I think the challenge for a lot of them is just the time factor. So that's why I'm hoping that ALS Untangled helps them with the time factor. Yeah.
Thank you. And another question I wanted to jump in real fast before we go to the audience is for Dr. Smart. $500 for new technology that makes independence in your home or public environment easier. What is the next step that it'll take for you to get to that commercialization of the concept?
I think mostly it's figuring out how to take the fancy sensors we have on there and use something like an Xbox Connect sensor, or something that's cheaper, something that you use in cell phones, and make the software work with that sensor rather than the really fancy ones. So I think it's developing more than research.
All right, we're gonna switch microphones here. I'll give you guys this one to answer questions with. And I'm going to give you the opportunity in the audience to ask questions.
Well, I have a question for is Lunasin and Protandim AOTs?
Yes, they are AOTs, as I defined them. So they're things that are advertised as possibly being able to slow, stop, or reverse ALS without really great evidence right now. One of the nice things about those is they don't require a prescription. So you email me, I'm happy to tell you where some of my other patients are getting those, who are using them outside of trials, but they're available on the internet.
Thank you all for a great afternoon of discussion. Questions for Dr. Bedlack, follow up on that last question. So there's 3 AOTs you mentioned that sound promising, but they certainly have not gone through the rigor of clinical research. Is there any hope for that happening? Is there any research money available for that? Is ALS Untangled moving in that direction? Can you move in that direction?
So yeah, the answer is yes. So we have actually started now the first pilot trial of Lunasin. We've got 50 spots in that trial. That's what our donor funded us for. The company's been great to work with. They've given us all the products for those 50 patients. We're working with patients like me. It's an unusual trial for a lot of reasons. First, it's I think the first trial that's been designed around a single patient with ALS who took something and got better. Usually our trials are designed around a test tube model or an animal model. Maybe it's time to expand the number of models. Not saying that those other models don't work, but maybe it's time to expand the number of models. Another thing that's unusual about it is I try to make that trial very patient-friendly. So it's just a pilot trial. We're just trying to get some idea, does this make any sense to possibly take into a more rigorous study someday? So the trial has very wide inclusion criteria. Almost anybody can be in the study. So I've got some patients enrolled who have tracheostomies and no strength at all in their arms and legs and have had ALS for many years. There are very few trials that have ever enrolled that type of patient before, and I think it's unfortunate. The trial has very few visits. So most of the visits are actual virtual visits. We teach you how to measure your own ALS FRS and how to use the website Patients Like Me. So we're making patients full partners. You're not just getting drug from us, you're actually going to be in charge of measuring things and recording data. So that a lot of times patients like the fact they don't have to make so many trips all the way to Duke to have things measured. There's no placebo. Again, it's just a pilot study. We're just trying to get some rough idea. And the thing that I like the best about it is this is a trial where the results are available in real time. So I think one of the most frustrating parts of all this for patients, I hear this over and over, is it's a really exciting idea. You know, for example, the copper, really exciting idea. Copper ASTM, very exciting. But it might be many years before we know if it worked or not. And for a lot of patients, they say, I just don't have that much time. So how can I, gamble everything that I have on waiting several years to know the answer to this? You'll be able to look at the results of this trial in real time and decide for yourself in 6 months. If it looks like a lot of people are having ALS reversals, I imagine Lunasen sales are going to skyrocket. But on the other hand, if it doesn't seem like much is happening, then I suspect we might even have trouble keeping our 50 patients in the trial. We'll see.
Actually, this is a question for both Dr. Beckman and Dr. Bedlack. You just alluded to the challenge of the time it takes for things to move from that's translational research into the clinic. For Dr. Beckman, what sort of time frame do you think is going to happen with copper ATSM and any variants that you might test in terms of what sort of is a normal time frame for a study like that to be able to move into the clinic?
So it's always a hell of a lot longer than I dare hope. And I was hoping the copper ATSM would have been in trials a year ago. There are always things that happen, and then there's a series of questions that get raised by various committees in the process. And the blinding and the lack of analysis of results is also an important part of the trial. You can do these open trials for something, but you're playing with a drug, and it's $1 billion gamble as to whether it works. And that's partly why, if you're trying a drug that would really be one that you have to have a prescription for, that you go through these blinded studies and a much more careful evaluation. But it's also why it's hugely expensive and very frustrating. So in the end, you might get some preliminary evidence from a study of 50 patients, and there's a lot of things, when I talk to a few patients in between, there are a lot of micronutrients and things. Like lipoic acid is one that activates the NRF2 pathway we've worked with a lot. It's a different way of activating something that looks positive. Now, I'm a big believer in trying the over-counter medications, but you also, it's a big gamble as you try to go through this to say, do you have a really effective drug? What's your best chance of getting it out so it actually would be approved and available widely and financially available, possible too?
Yeah, I'll just make a comment.
About the work that's being done to speed the FDA approval process?
Yeah, so just to start with the first question, I think the surest way that we get to a cure for ALS is by doing the types of research pathways that have worked in other diseases, right? So, in our lifetime, we've seen dramatic drug discovery for HIV. Remember back in the 80s how terrifying it was? Just about everybody died a horrible death from that disease, and now almost nobody does. So, certain types of cancer, we've got dramatically effective treatments for. And all those treatments arose from the type of pathway that we've been following in ALS. Test tube models, animal models, preclinical work, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. That's the surest way we get there. But I do think that maybe there's some room for something more unusual too. And so that's kind of where ROAR comes. A pilot trial that's very unusual, that gets more people involved, and that people can even do on their own outside of the trial, since it's a nutritional supplement that does not require a prescription. So yes, there definitely are ways that we can improve on this tried and true pathway. And other diseases, have done this, and we've learned from them. And I think the ALS Association is really taking a nice lead on this. So many of you may know that we've spent, the past year working on a guidance document for the FDA, ways that we think we might be able to really make the whole process more efficient, ways to highlight some of the existing programs that seem to be underutilized. So folks were talking earlier about the program, the HBO program VICE, and there were some great things that did. Anytime we get ALS mentioned, on a huge stage like HBO or the Wall Street Journal. It's a victory for all of us. We want this to be number one in people's minds so that we get as many resources focused on it as we can. But there was also one thing that was completely wrong in that show. There was a comment made that the FDA has these expanded access programs, but companies can't afford to do them because the FDA doesn't allow companies to recover any of their costs. That's wrong. The FDA's expanded access programs specifically specify that companies who decide to do this, to offer these drugs to patients during development, can recover the cost of the drug, okay? What they can't do is price gouge. And so people often say to me, well, gee, how come people in Europe can get this particular drug that's in development, but I can't? Well, some of the drugs that are in development are being sold over in Europe for costs in the order of $95,000 for a 2-week supply. This is a drug being sold to people where we have absolutely no evidence that it's either safe or effective. So do we really want that kind of model here in the United States? I don't think we do. I mean, I think that the FDA's expanded access programs make a lot of sense. It's just that we've got to try to get companies to use these more so that more patients can have access to these kind of things. And I think Right to Try is now, there's a lot of good sentiment in that. I think it's pretty clear that people with terminal illnesses, have got the attention of policymakers. This law is being passed everywhere. The law itself is probably not going to change very much, but at least it has focused attention on the problem. And maybe by focusing attention on the problem, pathways like expanded access that actually do make a lot of sense will be utilized more. That's what I'd like to see.
This is for Dr. Beckman. My name is Lisa. I was diagnosed with ALS 2 years ago. I have been a potter and a ceramic teacher for over 27 years. I've used copper oxide and copper carbonate in glazes for many years. Could the use of copper or other metals in the glazes over the years contribute to my ALS?
So it's a great question. There's a possibility, but I don't think that really you should be blaming yourself for doing that. And I think it's probably very unlikely. In science, there's always a possibility something could be real. There really could be aliens that Mulder found. And there are certainly a lot of different effects of copper toxicity. And you can look for different aspects of it. Now people are starting to look at it. They found mutations in certain copper transporters that cause an infantile form of motor neuron degeneration. So pieces of it are coming together. Copper carbonates are really insoluble and you don't absorb much, and your body has great mechanisms for dealing with it. I think there's a lot of searching in everybody for what caused the disease. Football players, was it injuries? It's possible. And we're really good as people at finding connections. But quite often the disease started long before. It's just really hard to know when it started, what caused it, what went on. There are people that do recover, and the usual response is, well, they really didn't have ALS. They weren't diagnosed right. I think this is really admirable to start to go look at it, and with new tools and going after genetics, we really can learn an enormous amount about why people progress slower than others, and that'll give us big clues. But really, the disease probably started for a long time before. And there are a lot of young men who are athletic. They seem to develop ALS early. This motor expansion of muscles, I think that may be very real. But even that is very hard to make any real large connection to it.
Hi, I'll try it. It's regarding Wellbutrin. That drug seems to be enigmatic to me in that I hear so many different stories about it. It's, recommended, it isn't, it prolongs your life. there's no one answer for this drug. And so I'd like to know the journey of how that got approved. And what are your thoughts on it?
Sure. I mean, I can tell you how I present the drug to patients. I've had to do that, more than 2,000 times now in the past 16 years. So what I tell people is, okay, so first we have to kind of decide, what your goals are. So presumably your goals are to live as long as you can and as well as you can. And so if those are your goals, well then I think it makes sense to consider the one and only drug that in 100 years of research has reproducibly been shown to prolong survival in the best possible clinical trials that you can do. Large, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. That's the only drug that's stood up to all that. Clearly, all those trials showed that people who take the drug live longer than people who don't. Now, sometimes people are at a place when they see me for the first time where that's not their goal. They don't want to live as long as they can with the disease. They're already at a place where they don't have much quality to their life, and they tell me that's not, I don't care about that. But that drug clearly has been shown to prolong life. And as to the question of 3 months, well, I'll just say this. Do you take any medicines for anything else? Like, for example, blood pressure. If you do, I doubt that your doctor came in and said, okay, your blood pressure's high, let's start this drug so that we can reduce your blood pressure by 11 points, because that was the difference that we saw in the clinical trial between the people who took it and the people that didn't. We know that people respond differently to drugs. Nobody would ever say that about a blood pressure medicine. Some people might have a 50-point change in their blood pressure, and some people probably wouldn't change at all. And the same thing's probably true of riluzole. We can't extrapolate from a clinical trial to what it's going to do in an individual patient. But I just come back to what I said before. It's the one thing that we know prolongs survival as far as medicines. And it's generally very well tolerated and very safe with a minimal amount of monitoring.
So riluzole is a really interesting drug, and I mentioned my friends in South America. When I first met them, they were actually testing riluzole in astrocytes and motor neurons for Rhone Blanc, the company at the time that was making it. So the mechanism of action, what does it do? It's thought to work as an anti-glutamate drug. And so you've got two things. There's an empirical finding. You do a double-blinded placebo-controlled study. It works better. You pour it onto some cells, and maybe there's an effect where a neurotransmitter works not quite as well, or reabsorption. And that becomes linked as to the mechanism. So what they did is a lot of studies, and they found that it really doesn't work in the way that everybody talks about in reviews. And it actually has a whole other set of effects. And it stimulates a lot of different genes. It has that are trophic factors. So you heard briefly about the NRF2 pathway of turning on the anti-inflammatory pathways. This does seem to stimulate pathways, but it does so only for a week or two. And then it downregulates it and goes the other way. So what we've been working on, we have results in mice and in cells, that actually the way you give the drug actually makes a difference. That taking drug holidays could make this drug a lot more effective than taking it in the way that it's standardly prescribed. We've had a hell of a time getting any funding for it for about 4 or 5 years, because there he says, oh, the drug's been around forever, we know everything about it. But it is an example of the real need to understand and probe things and look much more deeply at it, particularly because every 5 years we have whole new sets of tools that are much better than we had a few years before to look at these problems. And then you need to start to convince people to look at it and say, well, what would we do if we started to change the dosing regimen and the amounts? Because it really is kind of a wild guess of how much you give. And the idea that there might be phases with a holiday you could get past the adaptations. Those are things that are unexplored, and I think there's opportunities to do a lot more research on a lot of other things like that.
I want to ask if astenib would be considered the most promising while we wait for copper.
I actually can't tell what is the most promising. So it was pretty exciting to see that it passed the test of futility of the phase 3 trials. Most drugs that have been tested in ALS, they show some effect in phase 2, they go to phase 3, which is a lot more patients, a lot different types of patients, and there's no effect or things go worse. The caution is that this company in France that's doing this actually jumps into a lot of trials with this drug and a lot of different indications. And it's going to need to be replicated, not only finishing the phase 3 study, but other groups need to test it. So I'm hopeful it works. We have a pretty good idea of why it works, at least in rodents, and the difference in rodents and man isn't as great as you might think. But then I don't know actually what other drugs are looking promising. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bedler.
Well, I think, having been in this field for 16 years, I think there's more exciting stuff going on this year than I've ever seen. I'm the most optimistic I've ever been about the next few years. I really think we're going to have something big because we're starting to finally understand the causes of ALS. So we've discovered so many new genes recently. We now have more than 40 genes that we know can cause ALS. And we know that familial ALS is a lot more common than we used to think. It's not just 5%, it's more like 10 to 15% of people have a gene that caused their disease. And while we understand those causes, we're learning about ways to manipulate genes, antisense oligonucleotides that shut off a bad gene, or CRISPR that rearranges a bad gene. Those technologies are nearing the point where we're going to be able to start using those in lots of trials. In fact, there's already an SOD1 antisense trial underway, sponsored by Biogen. We're also maybe on the cusp of understanding something about the cause of sporadic ALS. So a paper that did not get much attention from the media that came out earlier this year is the one from Dr. Avindra Nath from the NIH, looking at the possibility of an endogenous retrovirus as a cause for sporadic ALS. And for folks who don't know much about this, I can't resist talking a little bit about it if we have a couple minutes, just because it could turn out to be the most important paper in the history of ALS. It's got to be replicated, of course. So the idea is that there are certain things that we know can cause ALS mimics. One of those is the retrovirus HIV. How do we know that? Well, back in the 80s and in San Francisco, a whole bunch of young men were coming in with what looked like rapidly progressive ALS. Were also found to have HIV. Years later, when we developed better HIV drugs, we were able to treat some of these folks with the HIV cocktails and noticed that not only did we suppress the virus, but the ALS-like disease either stopped or in some cases reversed, suggesting that these retroviruses might be able to cause a progressive neurodegenerative disease, mostly affecting motor neurons. So for years, people have been looking for other retroviruses like HIV that might cause ALS with no success. So Dr. Nath did something that I never knew could be done. He looks not for retroviruses that come from outside of us, like HIV, but from retroviruses that are in us, endogenous retroviruses. Unbeknownst to me, a portion of our DNA is actually comprised of retroviruses that our ancestors were exposed to. If they didn't die from these retroviruses, they incorporated them into their DNA and passed that DNA on to us. It's called junk DNA because nobody ever thought it did anything. So Nath asked, could it be that people with sporadic ALS have a reactivation of one of these endogenous retroviruses? And he looked at a few of them, and it turned out that 10 out of 10 patients with sporadic ALS that he looked at had the reactivation of one of these retroviruses called HERV-K. Nobody that he looked at without sporadic ALS had that retrovirus reactivated. When he took that retrovirus and he put it in motor neurons in culture, they died. When he gave that retrovirus to animals, they developed what looked like some problems with their motor neurons. So it really looks like that retrovirus could be a cause for sporadic ALS, at least in some people. And now he's got a replication study underway where he's not only looking to see in a larger number of people with sporadic ALS, how often does this happen, but also if we treat these people with some of these HIV cocktails, can we actually make them better? So that's why I'm really excited about what's going on right now, is because for the first time we're attacking some of the causes of ALS. Before we were kind of shooting in the dark. We're trying to hit pathways that we think may be involved way downstream in ALS, and that's part of why we're not having much luck. If you don't know what causes something, it's hard to figure out how to fix it.
I'm in the Biogen SOD1 trial, and I want to hear what you think about the double-blinded placebo in ALS, we all progress differently, and it seems like there's no need for that.
So it's a great question. I really think that ultimately a trial has to be done with a placebo in ALS, especially if what we're looking for is something that might slightly slow the progression of the disease, which is, the goal of most trials now. Is that's how we set them up. We say we're hoping that this slows disease progression by 20 or 30 or 40%. It's a very noisy disease, and so we need to have some kind of comparator. So I think you might be able to get away without a placebo in a real early phase study, like I'm trying to do with Lunasin, where you're just trying to get a rough idea of what it might do. But I think if you're really trying to convince a regulatory body that something works to slightly slow ALS, you need a very well-designed study. Now someday that's going to change, because someday the drugs that we're looking at are going to be things that we hope will actually reverse ALS. And there I don't see why you would need a placebo. If you did a trial of 100 patients and 70 of them had dramatic recovery of their motor function, who could possibly argue that that was a placebo effect? But we're not there yet.
Dr. Bedlack, I sent you some information a while back about being on CBD oil, and I was wondering if you could talk at all about the results.
Yeah, so one of the things that I looked at, with ALS Untangled pretty early on was, cannabis. And so there's a lot of mechanisms that cannabis has that look like they would be very interesting for ALS. So it's got very plausible mechanism by which it could work. We've got a lot of anecdotal reports off the internet of patients with ALS reporting things, but I don't have medical records and I don't have validated outcome measures. So it's not graded as high as those other ones that I talked about where I actually have the records. I would love to see a trial of it. It may be many years before I can do a trial of it in North Carolina. We can't even figure out what bathroom people are supposed to use in our state. But here, where it's more progressive, you all might be able to get a trial of it off the ground, and I'd love to see it.
I'd love to throw a question to Dr. Smart. We've been talking a lot about finding treatments for the disease, but in the meantime, we all are for giving people independence and a better quality of life. Your work is promising, and it's sort of, as Dr. Beckman described, the speed at which things are moving. It seems like every 5 years there's an exponential increase in sort of progress in technology. Do you see your field advancing in similar sort of paradigm?
Yeah, I guess I do. Technology is always leaping ahead, I think. One of the things that's really pushing a lot of the stuff that we do now in robotics is you can go out now and buy a robot for $100, and you can take one home and give it to a kid and they can play with it. And so it's putting a lot more people in front of the technology. And so a lot more people are playing with it, a lot more people are contributing, especially the open source movement where you do something and then you give it back to the community. It's kind of like ALS Untangled, which that community involvement thing, and I think that's a really powerful movement, no matter whether it's software or hardware or the work that these guys are doing. And I think what's really driving what's made robotics really good in the past few years is this cell phones. Because there's technology in cell phones that's really cheap now. When I started doing robotics, I had a video camera that I hooked up to my robot. It cost $50,000. $2. So that means that so many more people have it, many more people are playing with it, and some kid in his basement might discover something and make that share of work just so much better. So I think it's a mass scale community involvement that really driving all this.
Great, thank you.
Any other question?
Bear with me. So what again is the drug
that prevents you from emotions, from crying, to start with?
It's called New Dexta. Yeah, so it's a combination of two older drugs, dextromethorphan and quinidine. And again, it was an accidental discovery, but I've had a lot of experience with it. I think it's much more powerful than the other things that we used to use off-label to help people to regain control of their laughing and crying. In my experience, most people who take the drug have a dramatic, noticeable improvement in their laughing and crying within a week or so.
Yeah. I don't laugh much, but I've made people laugh most of my life.
We don't want to take that away.
I just went through 3 months, total of 45 hours, IVIG antibody infusions, and I'd like to comment on that. But I had a deal with my doctor that if the infusions didn't help me, that I'd get one free infusion of my choice for free. And that was Jack Daniels. And I'll say this, Jack Daniels really helped me for about 2 hours.
I was wondering, the Untangle website, if it had evaluated the quality-informed supplements that may be recommended, like vitamin E, the CoQ10, fish oil, like the quality informed. I'm a strong believer in like the quality and whether or not, we're not spending a large amount of money on supplements, but wanting to know like, are we investing for a buck? And is the form that we're using effective or not effective? Are we absorbing any of the turmeric that we're taking that I'm spending money on?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I mean, that type of work would require like a biochemistry lab that is really not part of what ALS Untangled does. We just don't have the resources for it. There are people who've looked at supplements and they do very wildly in terms of not only the quality of what's supposed to be in there, but what other garbage might be in there too. So for example, in California a few years ago, they went into some of these alternative medicine stores and just took all these bottles of Chinese herbs and took them into a lab and studied them. And a lot of them had just really high levels of lead and mercury and things like that in there that were not on the labels. So you do roll your dice a little bit, with these AOTs because, the FDA doesn't really regulate these things. So they're generally regarded as safe, GRAS, but even that statement implies that we don't know for sure because they're not rigorously tested. Just some of the things that you mentioned, I'll just make a couple comments on. So vitamin E was tested in ALS and it didn't work. Coenzyme Q10 was tested in ALS and it didn't work. So this is a conversation that I often have with my patients. Like a lot of times they'll come in and they're on a whole bunch of stuff. And I'll say, do you want any feedback on any of this stuff? Well, first of all, let's get rid of the stuff that we've already tested that we know doesn't work. If we've already tested it and it doesn't work, there's no point in taking it. And then, we can talk about some of the things that I've looked at with ALS Untangled that look more promising and whether those are things that you want to incorporate in your regimen. So like the Lunasin and the Protandim, that kind of stuff. But that's the conversation that I have with my patients.
So I'd like to comment, I have a slightly different view on this too. So at the Linus Pauling Institute, there's an online resource called the Micronutrient Information Center that provides reviews of each of these things, what are the doses. We don't go and do tests for a lot of the products, but CoQ and vitamin E, most of the sources are pretty safe. And there are some recommendations that you can read on the label what they are. Herbal supplements, that's a wild jungle in there. I don't agree entirely that we've tested vitamin E and we've tested ubiquitin and they didn't work in clinical trials, so you shouldn't take them. I was on the panels that reviewed a lot of these grants and have looked at it. And vitamin E is not going to cure your disease. And you know, even Lou Gehrig was taking massive amounts of vitamin E long ago. I did mention a slide that if you are taking it before you get the disease, the incidence is much lower, as well as in Alzheimer's and other things. So there are a lot of things that can't push you over the edge of saying this is clinically effective. It doesn't mean they don't work. And you know, if you're not spending a fortune on it, I wouldn't worry about it. I mean, you know, it's not going to harm you either. So you know, a cumulative effort of a multiple number of these things might have slight effects. And it's just too hard to measure in clinical studies, which are a pretty high hurdle to get over. There are biochemical measures we can do where we can see effects of these things. These are biomarkers. So I wouldn't do this with any drug or try to say, you know, this is medically proven. But, you know, if it was me, I would take it and keep going with it. So.
I don't believe that it's going to cure him, but whether or not it's going to impact the progression or give his body more resources or
Exactly.
whatnot.
I don't know either, but we do know vitamin E gets in the brain. It has a fairly potent effect on neuroinflammation. Same thing with ubiquitin, I'm sorry, CoQ10. And there was a lot of hope these things work. There was some animal evidence, and I agree that it wasn't enough to really say it's going to work. But I don't think you're going to be doing harm to yourself, and you might be doing just a very slight amount of protective effect. I also find it very interesting that you're in the Biogen study, because I talked to Biogen trying to get them to try our drug. And the antisense came from a company that had the unfortunate acronym ISIS, which they had to change. And if you read the exclusion criteria for being in your trial, it's having ever taken or will take copper ATSM. So I have the honor of being on the ISIS exclusion list.
All right, we're well past our times.
Just one more question. How soon will the copper trials be started in the United States?
So the safety studies in Australia are any week. It's down to one human use review board, and it should have been months ago. The IND application, the investigative new drug application for the FDA, goes in 2 weeks to the FDA, give or take. And then after that, I'm not sure. It's months, depends how much the FDA wants, if they accept the evidence. Once we have the safety data from the Australia study, it'll be much easier to do it in the States. So it's happening, it's just, I wish it was a few months ago.
All right, thank you guys. We are well past our time, so I want to thank all of you for sharing your afternoon with us. Our panelists will still be here in the room for a while if you want to approach them and ask a question that maybe you didn't feel like asking in public. And I know they're all very generous with their time and their knowledge. So we want to thank all of them for their time this afternoon presenting and for informing us about their work and the progress that they're making in each of their fields. So thank you all very much.